While they were talking about this, Jesus himself stood among them and said to them, "Peace be with you." They were startled and frightened and thought that they were seeing a ghost. And he said to them, "Why are you frightened, and why do doubts arise in your hearts? Look at my hands and feet. See that it is I myself. Touch me and see, for a ghost does not have flesh and bones, and as you see that I have." And when you had said this, he showed them his hands and feet. Yet for all their joy, they were still disbelieving and wondering. And he said to them, "Have you anything here to eat?" They gave him a piece of boiled fish, and he took it and ate in their presence.
Well done. Once upon a time. Magic words. Some people think it's abracadabra, alakazam, but the most magical words I think we can hear are once upon a time. When we hear once upon a time, things change in ways that we can't always explain. When we hear once upon a time, we let go of reality a little bit, right? We can enter into a suspended disbelief. We can accept any crazy plot, any unrealistic outcome. We can accept any miracle that may come to pass as long as someone starts with once upon a time. If only the women at the tomb would have known this story hack. If only the disciples on the road from Emmaus had known to start their report to the disciples with once upon a time. Maybe we wouldn't have such disbelief among the listeners. Maybe we wouldn't have Jesus asking, "Why are you frightened, and why do doubts arise in your hearts?" Well, Jesus, because no one said once upon a time, duh. Of course, we know that once upon a time comes with some of its own baggage, right? We dismiss the seriousness of the story. We dismiss the historical and scientific nature of the story as if we've actually given credence to science or history, right? When we hear once upon a time, we just sit back and enjoy the story. We think about what lesson it might teach us. We think about the ethic it might instill. We think about how it might inspire us to live in new ways, and we just let the story bring us joy. But we can't have that with Scripture, can we? Heaven forbid the Scripture bring us joy. Heaven forbid we learn from a story rather than spend all our time proving it was true. Heaven forbid we be shaped by a story rather than judging those who don't believe the story's true. Think for a moment. Think for a moment, what lessons have you been willing to take from a fairy tale? From a once upon a time story? What lessons did you learn from once upon a time stories? Careful trusting strangers too quickly, especially if they have fangs and a snout. Thank you, Little Red. Just because something's just the right size doesn't mean it's yours. Thank you, Goldilocks. We all change and grow, even if others can't imagine it. Thank you, Little Duckling. Status is a mirage that can't compare to cleverness and a little hustle. Thank you, Puss in Boots. People are complicated and have layers, so grace and patience is important. Thank you, Shrek. Also begins once upon a time. Seriously, though, we give power to these stories. We let these children's books shape our ethics, and we also love to tell the stories. We let them bring us joy. We let them bring joy. Then we get to the Bible, where it seems that too often it's where joy goes to die. People are so determined to spend their lives proving that it's all factually true, even though the lessons of many verses are about living by faith and not proof. Even though much of the Bible is not intended to be history or science. Even though some of the things that they are trying to prove true are metaphors. In our story, if the gospel requires proof, we've already lost the point. If it requires proof, we've lost the point and there is no joy. Some people are determined to spend their lives waiting for the story to complete itself, for the end of the story to come. Even though Jesus said no one knows when he will come again, even though Jesus gave clear directions on how to live, even though Jesus said he would not eat with them again until God's kingdom came, and then, as we heard this morning, he ate food with them. Just saying. If our story, if the gospel is just an invitation to wait for the end times, we've already lost the story. And there is no joy. In either case, we can see what happens when we become so wrapped up in what is written in the book rather than transformed by its teachings. When we get frozen by our fascination or fanaticism with the book rather than moved by the word, by the story within the scriptures. Either way, there's no joy. Only judgment and justification. The story gets picked through to highlight the teachings of those in power. The story gets hijacked to support the power of those in the majority. And meanwhile, we miss the bigger story. So I want to invite you to try to hear it differently today. Let's start with something we know works. Are you ready? Once upon a time. Once upon a time, a baby was born to a couple whose people had seen such great suffering. Strangers came, believing that this child would grow to be a king. But it frightened the current king, who called for all the children to be killed. So the baby and his parents escaped as refugees to a far-off land. Many years later, when it was safe, the family returned, and Jesus and his parents came back to the family and community that had missed them so. Jesus grew to be a truly wise person, even from a young age, was truly smart, even from a young age. And as he grew, people gathered around him for guidance and in search of miracles. Yes, Jesus grew to be a teacher and a healer. Miracles took place around him. Sometimes it seemed he planned it. Sometimes it seemed to just happen. And as Jesus drew bigger crowds, he spoke to them about the injustices they faced, the hardships they saw, the things their people had been through for so long. Jesus spoke about injustice, those in power. And as he spoke, the crowds grew. It even began to include those in power who came to discredit him. Jesus taught about forgiveness, grace in love, calling upon those who followed him to practice these in all they did, calling upon those in power to let these concepts guide them as they enforced rules, calling upon those who felt lost and alone to trust in God. Many remembered the predictions of those strangers who spoke at Jesus' birth. Many were convinced that God would send someone to make them a powerful nation again, so people began to believe that Jesus was the leader who would unite them, the rescuer who would guide them into victory in war. But Jesus said no and tried to show another way. He reminded them again about peace, love, and grace. But when Jesus said no and tried to teach a different way of being, a different way of believing, the people who had followed and those in power killed him. Yet those closest to the story, those who were closest to him, tell the story of an empty tomb. Those closest to him tell the story about a resurrection. They tell a story about a child who would be a king in ways people never imagined. They tell a story of a person who claimed love was more powerful than death. They tell a story about how God came into the world in a brand new way. Not to bring new rules, not to build cities or empires. They told a story of how God came into the world in a new way, inviting all people to be bound in love, inviting all people to be connected in the grace they share, inviting all people to love their neighbor, themselves, and God. And in this story, there is still so much joy. If we hear the Easter story and then spend our days demanding others believe the story, we've changed nothing. We're still living in an imperial mindset, still imposing beliefs and judgment on others, and there is no joy. If we hear the Easter story and then spend our days waiting for God to put us out of our misery, well, God help us, Jesus might as well have stayed in the tomb. There is no joy in that story. Yet, if we accept the invitation, if we hear the story, if we listen to the women who were at the tomb, if we listen to those who met Jesus along the roadside, whose hearts were burning within them as he spoke, we are reminded that new life is always springing up around us. We are assured that love is greater than death. We are invited to live with love and grace that guides us. If we listen to the women at the tomb, we have new eyes for how to see the world around us. We have new direction in how to make decisions and how to treat others. And we will see God at work in places we would have missed before. Imagine Jesus appearing and asking us today, why are you frightened? Why do doubts arise in your hearts? Why are we frightened? Why do doubts arise in our hearts? There's a lot of stuff going on out there, Jesus. Maybe he would rephrase it for us. Why is it hard to believe that a good thing happened? Why is it hard to believe that good things will happen? What joy do we diminish? What miracles do we minimize or dismiss? Church, each of you have seen miracles. Each of you have seen miracles. We need to tell our stories. We need to name and claim our own miracles. We have the story that happened today, but then we also have the lesson of the story today. Jesus meets with the disciples and says, "Why is there no joy in this room?" We need to take the time to ask ourselves the same question and then tell our miracle stories. When should you have died and you didn't? Some of you have those stories. I've heard you share them. When should you have been punished, but you were not? When did you receive support and grace, and it was the last thing you ever expected? But it changed everything. When was the time you didn't get what you expected, but discovered something even more beautiful? When was the time you looked back with new eyes and truly saw the events that unfolded? and can't call it anything but a miracle. That time when you feel like you would prefer to have just stayed in the tomb. But something changed within you. When was the time when you felt like all hope was lost, but somehow joy found a voice? We need to tell our stories. We need to name and claim our miracles. Some of you are comfortable telling stories. Others of you are newer to the idea. Some of you are great at the spectacle of presentation. Others are unnerved by it. If you can't figure out how to tell your story, if you're worried people won't listen, won't believe, won't understand, keep it simple. Just start out with the magic words. Once upon a time.